Ready? So I want to welcome Mr. Jeff Bozanic, correct? All right, cool. I got it right. I'm going to make you the star here for talking, make you put the spotlight on you. All right. Mr. Bozanic, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really, really looking forward to hearing about your exploits in the Antarctica with the Scouts. I know this is such a treat. So, sir, the floor is yours.
All right, so let me introduce myself. My name is Jeff Bozanic. I'm a scout leader in Orange County Council, just a little bit south of you guys. I'm the actually just resigned as the scoutmaster of a girls troop. I've been an assistant scoutmaster for a boys troop for 8 years, and I'm also the committee chairman for a crew down there. And so I get to do a lot of stuff. In fact, I ran a co-trip, a joint trip with a unit from Greater LA Council. You guys are Greater LA, right? Excellent. We hiked with 2 troops from Orange County Council.
Sorry, sir, we're actually Long Beach and Greater Los Angeles.
Oh, okay. We walked the entire John Muir Trail as a scout trip, 270 miles over a 3.5-week period 2 years ago. So there's a lot of really fun stuff that you can do out in scouting, and that's one of the reasons I'm still involved. This program is actually going to be on some of my work that I've been doing down in Antarctica. And so I'm going to try to share my screen here. There we go. Do you guys see it? Yes. So we're going to talk about research diving in Antarctica. And I am going to, let's see. This is great, except for, there we go. So Antarctica is known as the white continent. And when you fly down there, this is pretty much what you see. It's either going to be flat and white, or it's going to be mountains and white, but it's all white. And in fact, something like 70% of the world's fresh water is tied up as ice on the continent of Antarctica. There's a lot of water there. One of the things that people don't realize is that Antarctica is the highest continent on the entire planet. And the reason is because the continent is buried in up to 3 miles of ice over nearly the entire thing, which raises its altitude really high. Something else, you guys probably all know that it's the coldest continent on the planet, but you may not recognize or realize that it's also the driest continent on the planet as well. Antarctica gets very little precipitation, either in the form of water or snow and ice. Lots of water down there, but very little of it comes down any given year. A lot of it blows from point A to point B, but it doesn't come down as fresh snow and ice. And so it's really a polar desert. Where I was based on my first several trips down there was here at McMurdo Station. McMurdo Station is about 2,500 miles south of New Zealand. It's located on the Ross Sea right here, just about 700 miles from the South Pole. When we actually flew down there on planes, they fly a variety of aircraft down there. And my first trip down there was the very first trip on a C-5, which is a very large cargo plane. And it was the first time they'd ever attempted to land the plane in Antarctica. And the interesting thing about it is, as you look at this picture right now, that runway is built on the surface of the ocean. So if that ice were to melt or that ice were to crack, we would fall right into the sea and sink. And in fact, that happened to one of the aircraft that landed in 1964. The entire aircraft broke through the ice and sank to the bottom of the ocean. So it's a pretty scary thing to go down there and to do some of this stuff sometimes. When we stepped outside, you guys can see that it's nice and sunny. And it was a balmy 20 degrees below zero when we got out of the airplane. So it also is fairly chilly. We actually were based on an island called Ross Island. And this is the home of one of the only active glaciers in Antarctica. This is a picture of Mount Erebus. And if you look at the top, those clouds are actually steam plumes that are coming off the top of the volcano. It's about 12,000 feet high. And by the way, if you guys have questions as we're going through here, please feel free to unmute yourself, ask the question, and then mute yourself again. I can't look at the chat screen and do this at the same time. So it's easier for me if you guys actually ask questions verbally.
Actually, I have a question, sir. So active volcano, did you get any type of eruptions while you were there, or was it just a steamer?
We just got steam.
Okay.
So all of the work down there is sponsored by the National Science Foundation, which is a government group that sponsors basic science. And nobody at this research station is allowed to be there unless they're there under the auspices of the NSF, National Science Foundation. Now, my work is as a scuba diver. That's what I do for a profession. And people, when they first started diving, when they first started working underneath the ice there, we're looking at the entire oceans covered with a sheet of ice anywhere from 7 feet to about 25 feet thick. So originally what people did back in 1956, 1957, 1958 for the International Geophysical Year is they used to drill a hole in the ice, and then somebody, a scientist, would hold their breath, swim out underneath the ice, holding their breath, and study the fish and the organisms that are there. And when they ran out of breath, they would swim back to the hole and back to the surface again.
That's crazy.
That's pretty gutsy.
Were they even in wets? I'm hoping they were in wetsuits.
They were in wetsuits, not dry suits. And that water temperature there is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't freeze at 32 like fresh water because of the salt content in the water. And in fact, the primary scientist that did that work back in 1957, 58 was my mentor when I was in junior college. And he used to tell me these stories, and I would just say, "You have got to be kidding."
Is this an observation platform? Because I see glass there.
Well, that's the next thing they did. The next step was you couldn't spend very long there. So they decided to build essentially an underwater observation chamber. And what this is a little tiny room on the end of a pipe. And they drill a hole in the ice. They tilt this pipe upright and drop it through the hole in the ice. And now you climb into the top of the pipe, run down a ladder that's welded to the side, and then you step in this little tiny room down at the bottom. And that allowed people to stay longer. The problem with that is you couldn't get very close to the animals that you wanted to observe. And as the current swept things to the side, you'd be like, "Oh, wait, stop. And then it'd be gone." And so people started scuba diving down there with scuba gear in the 60s. And my first trips down there in 1989 through 1992, I was using regular scuba gear. So this is a picture of somebody inside the observation chamber looking out, and that's a picture of me looking in.
Oh my God, that's quite that selfie.
You like that?
That's a gratuitous selfie right there.
Exactly.
No shame.
So most of you guys have probably seen scuba equipment if you don't scuba dive yourselves. You know, I've worked with a Sea Scout ship in Arizona, and everybody on that ship scuba dives. But this is a picture of what normal scuba gear is. And if you look over here, you see lots of bubbles coming up. We breathe off of scuba tank. Whoops. And then when you exhale, all the bubbles come out and you lose your air, you lose your gas. And a scuba tank will last you anywhere from 30 minutes to maybe an hour, depending on how comfortable you are and how deep you are.
So are you using dry suits now? Do you use dry suits to stay warmer?
Yes, and I'll show some photographs of that later on. So what we're now using, and what the purpose of this trip was, this was my last research trip through the NSF in 2016, we're using rebreathers. And what a rebreather is it captures the gas. When we exhale, it captures the gas, it sends it through a chemical bed that removes the carbon dioxide, puts it into a breathing chamber that senses how much oxygen there is, adds enough oxygen to make up for what we've consumed, and then we breathe it over again. And so that gas just goes around and around and around in circles, which is why it's called a rebreather. And this will allow us to stay underwater for 8 to 10 hours.
I was just going to ask your bottom time. That is amazing.
Now, not 8 to 10 hours in Antarctica because we got cold before then. But if we were up here, I've done 4 and 5 hour dives here in California comfortably without a problem at all. So another advantage of this, because there's no bubbles, is that sometimes you can get closer to the animals that you see. So here's a picture of a shark. See the shark here? And this was taken in a place called Socorro Island, south of Cabo San Lucas. And this was, in a week's worth of diving, the very best picture that a scuba diver with a normal scuba tank was able to get. So we're at about 120 feet deep when this picture is taken. We've spent 25 minutes there. All of the scuba divers have run out of air at this point in time, and they now leave to go to the surface. But I was using a rebreather, and so I could actually stay longer than them. So they all left, and I stayed.
Wait a minute, you didn't have your dive buddy?
I had no dive buddy. Hear no evil, spook no evil. 10 minutes after they left.
What's spoken in the Zoom stays in the Zoom.
Amen, Yvonne.
Exactly. 10 minutes after they left, this is what it looked like.
Oh, wow.
I had about 50 sharks literally rubbing their fins against my side.
Tell me you petted one.
Leave no trace. I'm not sure I could confess to that.
Okay.
But they didn't seem to care. You know, and the reality is, as far as I was concerned, I was a rock. They could not tell that I was a person. They didn't care. And they just came in and did what they normally did. And this was actually a cleaning station. So they were there so that fish could come in and pick at their skin to clean off the parasites. So they were actually happy to have me rubbing their skin because it helped clean the parasites off of them.
Oh, wow. Silly question. What type of sharks were they?
Galapagos sharks, blacktip sharks, white-tip reef sharks, silky sharks, and brown sharks.
So just a few.
Yeah. It's also allowed us to come in and get close to other organisms that normally don't let you get close at all, like the sperm whale. And I've actually had whales come up to me underwater right off Newport Beach, literally 3 feet away, where I could reach out and again just rub my hand right down their side as they swam by me.
What an honor.
You know, I had a baby sperm whale come up, no, baby humpback whale down in Mexico one time, come up and lay its head on my shoulder as its mom was watching us. I mean, you just have some really incredible, awesome experiences sometimes. So from a scientific perspective, rebreathers offer us a chance to be able to have interactions and to be able to do observations that we could never do at scuba. Now, in Antarctica, we don't have a lot of big animals like that. But what we do have are places like this lake. And this is actually a freshwater lake that we're looking at here called Lake Frixel. This is a glacier, the Commonwealth Glacier that comes off the side. And you see this shadow here? This is a cliff face that is 100 feet high. So that gives you a little idea on the perspective and the scale on this photograph.
Wow.
My job was to dive into this lake. And what we were doing was putting in instrumentation that would suck up a water sample once a week, because people can't study this lake during the wintertime because the weather is so awful. And they actually think that this lake may be a model for where we might find life on Mars. The average temperature here in this site was minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is almost identical to the average temperature in Mars.
But not freezing. But the water's not freezing.
Well, the top 25 feet of the water is frozen.
Okay.
We had to melt a hole through 25 feet of ice before I could get into the water. And then underneath the water is stratified like a layer cake with different types of water chemistries in each layer, with life in the bottom layer. And so we wanted to study this lake to see if, in fact, we get to Mars, if we can find a similar place on Mars where we might find life. And in fact, they have recently found ice, surface ice on Mars, which may in fact be a lake. We don't know. There might be liquid water there. We have no means of telling that at this point in time. Now, our job on this trip was to study whether or not rebreathers could actually be used in Antarctica, because nobody had ever done this in this kind of water temperature before. So this was our research team. This is Christian McDonald, who's the diving officer at Scripps Institute. Rob Robbins, who's the diving officer at the National Science Foundation, which was the job I used to hold in 1989. John Heine, who's the head of the diving control board for the Office of Polar Programs, Steve Rupp, and myself.
Were all of these scout trips, or were these just some of the times you do in your expedition?
Trip.
Okay.
This is a non-scout trip. So most of my trips down there have had nothing to do with scouting. The first thing that we need to do is to get to where we go diving. And so we'd ride in these tracked vehicles to where we go diving. And sometimes the trips may be 2 hours in each direction of where we go, because we go all over around the island on the ice. And then when we get there, we try to dive out of these wooden plywood huts that we pull out there earlier. And we have a heater in this hut, so we don't have to be in the outdoor temperature, which might be, well, the coldest day I ever went diving was 63 degrees below zero.
That's all?
That's all.
Angelia just joined.
What's that?
Angelia just joined.
Oh, great. Hi, Angelia.
Hello.
So that's really nippy. And so it's really hard to work in those kinds of temperatures. Even Chewbacca there would have a trouble working in those kinds of temperatures.
What's the temperature inside?
Well, the temperature inside is great. It doesn't make a difference what you like. If you sit on the floor, the temperature is about 0, maybe 10 degrees Fahrenheit. If you stand up, the temperature around your middle is about 50 degrees. And if you sit up, your head is in about 120 degree temperature.
So it's warmer than outside.
It's much warmer than outside, and the air temperature is stratified inside because the hotter air rises to the ceiling. So until we start moving around, it's really a strange environment inside the hut. And in fact, oftentimes I would start to get dressed inside the hut. I would get too warm and I would step outdoors just to get cooled off so I could finish getting dressed into my dive gear. Then we have a hole in the floor, and we align that hole in the floor with a hole that we've drilled through the ice. And in this particular spot, the ice was only about 8 feet thick. And so we would drop through the ice and then go diving underneath the ice to be able to do our sampling.
Did you
and
have
I'm holding up this sign here that says 5,000th because this was my 5,000th scuba dive in my career on this particular
Whoa.
dive.
Did you have to worry about the top layer freezing while you were under?
We do, but in this, when we've got huts, we actually have heaters that run hot air right over the hole to prevent that. But when we do diving in open air, which I've also done, we used to station 2 or 3 people with shovels and nets to do nothing more than to haul ice off the top before it freezes us in. And there was one time where I had to push through about 5 feet of ice and loose ice to be able to get myself out. I really wasn't sure if it was going to happen or not. So yeah, that can be a significant hazard.
I see your face and your nose really aren't totally protected. How does your, like, I know the rest of you's covered in the dry suit, but how long do you get freezing? Does it get cold with your nose?
Well, how many of you have ever had an ice cream headache?
I think everybody.
The initial feeling when you jump in the water is like a giant ice cream headache. It's like someone's taking a dull ice pick and driving it through your forehead.
Oh.
But that goes away because after the first couple of minutes, you just go numb. And then you can typically most people spend between 20 and 30 minutes underwater before they get so cold that they have to come out. My longest dive was about an hour and 20 minutes. And by the time I used to end my dives when I was crying so much from the pain that I couldn't stay under anymore. So
Is the temperature process? Is the temperature pretty much the same throughout the year, or does it vary underwater?
Yeah, the temperature gets warmer in the summertime. So it goes from about 28.6 degrees Fahrenheit to about 28.7 degrees Fahrenheit.
Nice. So, I see that.
You know, what's funny is I didn't show a picture of me sitting in the hole in Lake Frixel, that freshwater ice. I'd been diving in the ocean for about a month and a half before I went there. And I was floating in the hole, water levels about my nose level. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I can't believe how warm this water is. And of course, the water in the lake is at the freezing temperature of fresh water, which is 32 degrees. So by the time I'd been there for a month and a half, that 28-degree, well, the 32-degree water felt significantly warmer than the 28-degree water I was diving in every day. You know, Einstein said, all things are relative.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once you get underneath the ice, you know, there's not a lot of life above the ocean, but underneath the ocean, there's all kinds of really cool stuff to see. Things like these starfish, big, huge jellyfish.
Wow.
You know, isopods. This looks like if you guys ever played with roly-poly bugs when you were a kid, this is like a roly-poly bug on steroids. Same family, only this one lives underwater, and some of them get to be as big as my hand.
That's awesome.
Sea spiders, pycnogonids. In California, we have these here, but they're only about 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters across. Again, these down there were bigger than my outstretched hand. I remember having a nightmare one time where I woke up that a 6-foot pycnogonid was chasing me while I was down there.
That's a whole other set of dreams.
Here's a picture of a sponge, this big white thing down here.
Holy
Some of
cow.
the sponges down there are as big as a Volkswagen bus.
Are you under the ice right there?
Yes, this is all under ice. This is the ice surface up here. You know, water visibility for any of you that are scuba divers here, if we have 40 or 50 feet of visibility, that's like an exceptional day. We all go out and run around yelling and shouting and screaming about how good it is. When I was down in the Antarctic, we would measure visibility in excess of 800 feet sometimes, which is way better than you ever see in the Caribbean.
Wow.
There you can see the ice surface up above the diver. A sponge here, a different type of sponge here in yellow. And this down here is a soft coral, just like you'd see in Fiji or the South Pacific.
Colors are beautiful.
Sea urchins, the little spiky things. Now, this is a really interesting feature that we have here. You can see starfish there. You can see the ice on the surface where the ice is frozen on the surface. But we also get ice that forms on the bottom called anchor ice. And the way that ice forms is that the island gets so cold on the surface from the wind blowing and the temperature dropping. You know, some days down there it's more than 100 degrees below zero. And it cools the ground of the island itself. And then that heat, it draws heat in from underneath the ocean. And as it draws that heat from the rock of the island from underneath the ocean, it drops below the freezing temperature of the water. And so you get ice forming on the bottom of the ocean, not just on the surface.
I've never seen that.
Well, most people have never seen that. And sometimes that ice will freeze around the organisms. The organisms will still be alive, but the ice will break off from the bottom and float and then travel sometimes miles and miles carrying those organisms with them. And when that ice finally melts, the organisms melt out and just crawl off. And that's one of the ways that migration takes place in the oceans down there. Some of the animals we see down there just look to me like alien organisms. I mean, this looks like to me like, you know, something that you'd see James Cameron put in one of his movies.
It's like it's attached to your arm.
Yeah, that's another type of jellyfish that we saw down there. That's, oh, that one wasn't particularly big, maybe 1.5 feet across. Now, here's another really interesting thing is that if you took a fish from here and dropped it in the ocean down there, it would freeze. It would freeze solid. In fact, you could put it on a stick and you could have a fish popsicle. Maybe call it a fishicle. I don't know. The animals down there, the fish down there have evolved a protein that prevents them from freezing. And that's the only way that they can live down there. And one of the things we study is how that protein works, because it's about 200 times more efficient than the antifreezes that we make for automobiles, for example. So we're learning from nature how to improve our own materials that we use up here. Another interesting thing is, here we can see our dive team. All of us have to take turns going in and out through the hole, because only one person can fit in that at a time. So that if you have an emergency, you've got to make room for the person who's got the emergency to get out. Or if you get cold at the same time, only one person can exit at a time. And it takes a while to get out. The bigger issue is that we aren't the only ones down there. We're not the only ones that want to use these holes. We don't have control over some of that.
What? Oh, Lord. Okay.
Some of the Weddell seals and the crab eater seals that live down there are a lot bigger than us. This one's about 1,200 pounds. They're air breathers, and they swim along and they say, "Oh, look at that. There's a hole." Normally they have to chew a hole with their teeth to keep it open all winter. And here, somebody's built them their own hole without having to work for it. And they go up and they situate themselves in the hole, and you've got to wait until they're done.
Well,
and that might be a while.
That's mighty Christian of you to wait.
You know, part of leave no trace. You can't disturb the wildlife where you're at.
How long do they typically stay in the hole that you would have to wait?
Typically 5 to 10 minutes, but that can seem an eternity when you're underwater looking up.
Mm-hmm.
So you asked about how we stay warm down there. So this is typically how I get started. I wear a layer of expedition weight polypropylene underwear. And then I put on the equivalent of a form-fitted sleeping bag over that. And you don't see it, but I also have another vest layer underneath that. So now I have 2 layers of polypropylene and a sleeping bag around me. Then I put on fur-lined boots over a pair of socks. And then you slip into a dry suit, which essentially is a form-fitted Ziploc bag that zips around your body. They actually designed the materials for this for the spacesuits before we started using them for diving underwater. So that's a picture of a waterproof zipper that keeps the water from leaking in through the suit. Then we put on several pairs of gloves and a glove that ties with a gauntlet. It seals to a gauntlet to the dry suit itself to hopefully keep your hands warm. And then we put heaters, little chemical heat packs in our hands, because our hands are typically the part that gets cold the fastest. And like I said, I used to finish my dives and I was crying from the pain of the cold in my hands.
How long do the heat packs last for you down there?
Well, the heat packs are supposed to last for 6 hours. The reality is that they're, you know, they mainly extend your diving by another 5 minutes. They don't really keep your hands warm. All they do is give you a little bit more time.
I think they need oxygen flow.
They do, and we actually have little tubes in our suits that allow us to dump some air into the hands periodically to provide that. And that allows us to stay underwater for 20 minutes to an hour. Now, one of the other interesting things is when you're down there, you see these stalactites here. These are actually called brinicles, and those are really thin ice. And what happens is the surface gets so cold that it freezes the ocean. But the ocean doesn't form saltwater ice. It forms freshwater ice. And so it extrudes the salts. The salts make a really salty brine. They trickle through the cracks in the ice and then down below. And because they're more salty, they can be colder than the ocean. And so they build a tube around themselves that sometimes can be up to 40 feet long as they continue to build a shell as they melt downwards or grow downwards.
Jeff, we actually have a question in the chat.
Go ahead.
Arlene wants to know, how much is all that extra weight?
Well, we're wearing the gear itself. The rebreathers weigh about 50 to 70 pounds. The extra, this is an emergency bottle that we call a bailout bottle. That weighs about 30 to 35 pounds. The suit that we're wearing with all the underwear builds a real bubble around us. So we can't get underwater with that bubble of air unless we have lead weights. And I typically carried 40 pounds of lead weights. So everything all told is probably 120 pounds, give or take.
Oh my. And then we have one of our leaders is Daphne Traeger. She's actually a teacher and teaches biology. She says we have a lesson on ice fish in her biology class.
Oh, very cool. So you're familiar with this.
Okay.
Now, sometimes we come across stuff that we don't expect to see. So this is the skeleton of a Weddell seal that we found. And they tagged the Weddell seals to be able to track migration patterns. And we actually managed to locate the tag on the seal. And it turns out that this seal was from an island that was 15 miles away. Now, the interesting thing about that is that during the 3 years since this seal was tagged, the ice between this island 15 miles away and where we found this seal has never melted. So the question is, how did that seal get from that island 15 miles away to where it died here near the Ross Island?
Is it possible for them to do an overland trip and going through one of the holes?
Well, we couldn't swim it. We're presuming it did overland, but that's a long distance, particularly without being able to get to the water to be able to feed. So it's one of the things that the seal biologists are studying right now. No trip is complete without looking at the penguins. The penguin is not the one in yellow, just so you guys know. And they'd occasionally just come scooting by on their bellies, going from point A to point B, and pretty much just ignore us. That's one really fat penguin, probably headed inland to relieve its mate, finish hatching the eggs and feed its young. And then one of the things I really like down there is the sense of history. You may have heard of Ernest Shackleton.
Yes.
Ernest Shackleton he was actually on several expeditions down there. The one he's really most famous for was his 1914 expedition. He missed being the first person to get to the South Pole a year before Ralph Amundsen did. And he was really bummed about that. And so he said, well, I'm going to run another expedition. I'm going to be the first person to walk across the continent of Antarctica. So his plan was to leave South Georgia Island, land in Antarctica, walk to the South Pole, and then walk to Ross Island, where I was. And this is where all the traditional explorers used to go, was to try to go this way and back again. He was going to go across the continent and end where everybody else started. So he took his boat, he got all the way down to the coast here, and then he couldn't quite get to the continent, missed it by that much. And his boat got trapped in the ice. And so they ended up having to spend the winter with the boat frozen in the ice, drifting with the ice, and it drifted them further and further away from Antarctica. And then the ice crushed the boat, and the boat sank. And so they continued to stay with the boat as the ice pack carried them north until the ice melted. And now they've got no boat and no ice. So they saved the whale boats, the long boats, which are about 20, 25 feet long. And they launched the boats and sailed to Elephant Island, which is great. They're now on land. They're no longer on the continent of Antarctica. You can see they're much further north. They're only about 500 miles from the tip of South America. But the problem is that there was nobody on Elephant Island. No telephones, no telegraphs, no internet, no carrier pigeons. So they had to figure out a way to save themselves. And so they took another whale boat, and 5 of them sailed across open ocean in the roughest oceans on the planet, 700 miles by dead reckoning, and got to South Georgia Island and landed on the wrong side of the island from where people were. and had to climb an unexplored mountain range 12,000 feet high, go over the mountain range and down the other side to get to the whaling station to get rescued.
That's insane.
It was completely insane. He then sailed back, borrowed a boat, sailed back to Elephant Island, rescued all of his people there, came back, realized that the group that was supposed to have picked him up from New Zealand had never been heard from again. So he sailed around to New Zealand, borrowed another boat, sailed down to Ross Island, found his entire team stranded that had been there for 2 years, rescued them, and brought them back to civilization again.
How did they survive for the 2 years?
Eating penguins, eating seals, using the fat from the seals to be able to provide lighting and fuel. The supplies that were, I'm going to show you some pictures of that actually. So this is a picture of McMurdo Station where I was based. And in fact, I lived my first year in this dormitory right here. My window was on this 3rd floor, right where that arrow is. The second year I was there, I was in this dormitory. You can't see my room because I was on the other side of the building. And this was the hut that Robert Falcon Scott built in 2005. And we used to go over and look at that hut on occasion. And one of the things that Shackleton's men did, this hut was only about 20 miles away from their station. They walked to that hut and took all of the food that Robert Falcon Scott had left behind and brought it back to their hut. This is the hut that Shackleton built. And this is the hut that his men were in. So Shackleton built this in his prior expedition, which I think was 1909 to 1911. And this is where his men stayed. And when you go in this hut, you can see all of the food that they had raided from Scott's hut sitting there. And all of the supplies that they had brought down, still sitting on the shelves there.
Pure concentrated coca?
Yep. When they were rescued, the weather had gotten really bad. They were afraid they only had a couple of hours to get everybody off Antarctica and away before the weather took their ship away and they might not get back again for another year. So when they left, it was like going up to you guys and saying, you guys, you've got 90 minutes to get out of your house. And everybody in your housing tract has to be on the boat in 90 minutes time. So grab what you need. You've got 90 minutes to get on the boat. If you're not here in 90 minutes, we're gone and you're staying. And we may never see you again. So just think about that for 1 minute. 90 minutes, you've got your entire house and you've got to get everything out of your house, your entire family, your dog, and your neighbors have to do the same thing. And you have to take turns loading onto the boat at the other end and give yourself time for that. Everybody is sharing one car to get everybody out of town.
Can't imagine it.
What are you going to leave? And they left a lot. And so when you go through the cabin now, you can find old research journals, old scientific specimens, clothing that they left behind, food supplies, books they were reading. You know, it's like a time capsule of everything that was there when they were there in 1915, 1916.
So when everyone goes to visit this, they just leave everything as it is. So kind of like the leave no trace, just don't touch it, just look.
Exactly. And in fact, you have to have special permission to go in and look at these sites to be able to get the keys to go in to be able to look at them. Now, you also may not know that in 1928, an Eagle Scout named Paul Seipel was invited to join Admiral Richard Byrd on his expedition to Little America. And in fact, they had thousands of Eagle Scouts apply for this position. He advertised for one Eagle Scout to go with him. And Paul was selected because Paul had 23 merit badges at the time, including taxonomy and carpentry and several other merit badges that Admiral Byrd thought would be advantageous for the expedition. And in fact, Paul became the group biologist his job was to do all of the taxidermy for all of the specimens that were collected during this 3-year expedition. And so there's a long history of scouting down in Antarctica. And Paul Seipel later became an Antarctic researcher in his own right. Have you ever heard of wind chill factors?
Yes.
Paul was the one who described that and invented the concept.
Amazing.
Now, I got involved in my own outdoor activities when I was a Boy Scout. So I'm also an Eagle Scout. And this is one of our backpacking trips that we used to do. We used to go backpacking for a week in the Sierras every summer. This is me down here. This is my younger brother, Scott. He's 2 years younger than I am. This is my father. And every year we would go walk 50 to 70 miles on the John Muir Trail or in the Grand Canyon or other places like that. And this is where I learned to be able to work in the wild. This is us crossing one of the passes up in the Sierras. I learned my snow camping and my snow survival skills originally. This is me learning how to camp when I was a youth. And when I was growing up, when I was in school, I was not a popular kid. You know, my idea of interaction during elementary school, for example, was at recess time, I'd walk outdoors. And as soon as I was outside, I would lean up against the school and I would read. That's what recesses were for. When I was in high school, I didn't have any friends because all I did was go to classes. I think the term for that is probably nerd.
Yeah, but
And
look at you now.
What's that?
Look at you now.
I'm still a nerd.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a nerd that learned a set of skills that were not taught in university or college. This allowed me to transition to working in the field and camping in places like Antarctica. The skills that I have that set me apart, that allowed me to be selected to go on these kinds of expeditions, were skills that I learned in scouting. The leadership skills, the camping skills, the ability to adapt, the ability to problem solve are all things that I learned in scouting. You know, I used to build snow forts with my scout group and we'd have snowball fights. That led directly into building emergency trenches and emergency shelters in Antarctica. This is a snow trench that we slept in. The air temperature was 40 degrees below zero. And yet here we were in a snow trench that we built perfectly comfortable. Temperature there was about freezing, about 30 degrees. I learned to cook in scouting. That's a picture of my son. I don't know if are any of you in the Order of the Arrow. You may have met my son. John Aaron is the current section chief for Area 4 South.
Oh, very cool.
So you may bump into him at conclaves or if you do lodge events, he oftentimes will get invited to those. So be sure to go and say hi to him, you know, if you meet him. He doesn't wear the glasses anymore. He got contacts. But I learned to cook in scouting, and here we are cooking in the middle of the plains in Antarctica.
Any special skills to cooking in Antarctica?
I could go on for hours about
okay.
winter mountaineering and stuff, so we don't really have time for that.
Okay, next call.
Now, the other thing is that scouting has allowed me to do work literally all over the planet. Working in the jungles. This is us carrying gear in through jungles that we've hacked with paths we've hacked with machetes to explore underwater caves and collect new species of animals. Working on deserted islands where they'd see literally no people ever. These birds we could walk right up to because they didn't know what a person was, and they would just stand there while you walked up to them. No conception that people were dangerous or that they ought to be flying away. Collecting underwater artifacts from burial sites of Mayan people that are underwater that haven't been seen for thousands of years. Finding human remains in burial sites in the Bahamas and Mexico and Philippines and many other places, you know, Hawaii, many other places that I've worked underwater. You know, exploring some of these caves. This is in Australia. The dive, this is where I'm there to scuba dive. It's in the middle of the outback in Australia. And the first thing we had to do was lower our gear 120 feet into a big hole in the middle of the desert, middle of the outback. And then we would go down cable ladders behind it. whoops, I don't have the next picture. And then we'd crawl another 150 feet underground through tunnels, dragging our dive gear behind us to where we got to go diving. All of these climbing skills I started to learn when I was in scouting with the climbing merit badge. Working in the Amazon rivers, the Amazon basin. And there I was, this was my first job out of college, was hired to go down there. And my job was to help them set up underwater gold mines, collecting gold from the jungles out there. And all of the skills I learned to be able to do this were skills that I learned in the Scout program. Learning to carry my 10 essentials, learning to be prepared, first aid skills, learning how to deal with problems, learning the leadership I needed. Like on this trip, I had 30 people working underneath me, running this operation. I was in charge. This was my first job out of college. I was 21 years old. I spoke no Spanish and they spoke no English. And yet I had to train them to dive, train them to find the gold, train them how to use the equipment, train them how to take care of it. And that leadership skill set that I learned in scouting. And that's what got me down to Antarctica. This is the top of Observation Hill with a cross to the first explorer that died in Antarctica in 1912. Now, I'm hoping to go back down. The next project that I'd like to do with the National Science Foundation is this particular spot. This is the bottom of the ocean. It's 100 feet deep, and the floor of the ocean is a floor of solid ice. I don't know why it's there. There's a glacier near there that's a wall of ice, but the floor butts up against the glacier and it's still solid ice. No glaciologist I've talked to has been able to explain why that's there. So I'm hoping to get a grant to go back down and study that. But before that happens, next year, oh, let me just say, there's a lot that you guys can do in scouting. There's a lot of, places you can grow. And this is my son going up the side of Half Dome. Let your imagination go. There's lots and lots of adventures down in scouting that you can do. This is us at the top of Half Dome. It's a great way to build relationships with your parents, with your friends, with your scout leaders, and they're things that you're going to remember for the rest of your lives. My next trip is actually a scouting trip where we're going down next December with a venturing crew. Last year, I brought one of my venture scouts down there, just like Admiral Byrd brought one Eagle Scout with him in 1928. Liam had such an interest, had such a great time and learned so much. I decided I wanted to try to bring an entire scout group with me. So I built in the ability to support 12 scouts down there. And I just am, and we're filled. I just started letting people know about it a week ago and we're already filled. I think I may open up 4 more spots. In fact, Angelea, who's on this call, just got one of those 4 spots. So we actually have room for 3 more overflow people if anybody is interested. That'll be gone for about 2 weeks next year. We'll be aboard this ship, the Plancius. So we're going to go across the ocean in a vessel instead of flying. And once we get there, you'll get a chance to help me with my research, to see penguins laying their eggs or hatching their eggs, to go walking on glaciers, to see some of these old ruins of some of the old exploration sites and things like that. So it ought to be a great learning experience and a great scouting experience. So with that, I'll take any other questions and thanks for your attention.
I've got one question I've been waiting to ask. What is the most unique thing that you've seen on your adventures that sticks out to you the most?
Oh.
Or just a few?
That's tough because if you ask me that question on any given day, I'd have a different answer. I've collected about 200 new species of animals with my partners. So I've got 4 animals that have been named after me. The first one I collected was really cool. I think one of the most unique things was I discovered the skeleton of an alien cemented into the rock a mile back in a cave in the Canary Islands in Africa.
Okay, where's the pictures? I'm ready. Classified.
The problem is my camera malfunctioned on that trip and I have no photographs.
Oh man.
And literally the whole skeletal structure of whatever this organism was just wrong. And for years, I used to tell people I'm finding ancient aliens in the middle of these caves. I actually think now that it was the structure of the skull of an eel, of a particular species of eel, that's really contorted compared to the way most normal skeletal structures are. But I'm not sure because I've never gotten back there to be able to look at it.
Alien story is better.
The alien story is better. I've been really blessed to be able to see a lot of extraordinary sights in my career. 3 summers ago, I was diving in a vortex of about 200 manta rays in the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean. All of them swimming around me, 200 of them in an area the size of a large room. And they were feeding on an eddy of diatoms, of plankton, that were swept in there at the high tide caused by the full moon that got trapped in this particular bay. And it only happens twice a year for 2 days at a time.
You got it right on the money.
Well, I was there with the BBC helping them film it for one of their Blue Planet series. So I can't take credit for that, but you're right. We were there right on the money with a lot of planning to get there. So it's this particular picture that you're looking at now was one of the most astounding places I've been. This is actually South Georgia Island, which is where Shackleton left from, a place called St. Andrews Bay. This is a king penguin, which is the second biggest penguin species on the planet. And there were 250,000 pairs of breeding penguins in this one beach. Started on the beach, went for a mile inland and all the way a mile up the hillside. Nothing but a dense flock colony of these penguins tending their eggs and their chicks.
How did they take to your presence being there?
They didn't care.
No.
They didn't care at all. In fact, if you sat down, I've got some other pictures where I laid on the sand, and within a couple minutes, I had about 30 penguins that were all just kind of walking up to me and pecking me and trying to figure out what it was I was. So, you know, these places are so remote and the animal life is so not used to seeing people that it's extraordinary what they will do to be able to come investigate with their curiosity. So what other questions might we have? Anything in the chat room that is there that I need to know about?
Let me see.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Jack.
How many times had you visited this place?
I kind of lost track. I think I've been down there 8 times. It might be 7, it might be 9, but somewhere in that neighborhood. My longest trip down there was 6 months. And I've spent probably 14 or 15 months down there in total.
Nice.
Yes, very. Anybody else have any questions? Oh, here we go. Okay, got one. Do you know if the astronaut spacesuits use the same breathing system as your diving technique?
Very similar, actually. They also use a rebreather. They use a different design because they've got to work in a different set of environmental characteristics. But in fact, they actually use a very similar piece of equipment. And one of the other projects I got to work on, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, was an aerospace group that was working out of Edwards Air Force Base. NASA's ex-chief pilot, before he retired, was building a glider that he was hoping to glide up to the edge of space. And because he was going to be higher than he could breathe, we had to build a breathing system in the cockpit of the glider. And what we basically did is we made the entire glider a rebreather, just like the scuba system that you saw us diving with.
Oh, that's really unique. All right, guys, anybody else got questions?
Was that the Perlin project?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. And how does atmospheric pressure factor into the use of the rebreather? I mean, you know, in the ocean, you've got 1 atmosphere every 33 feet down. You know, up at 70 or 80,000 feet, you know,
They actually were up above what's called the Armstrong limit. And the Armstrong limit is about 63,000 feet. And what happens is that, as you go up in the mountains, when you go to boil water to make your food, water boils at a lower temperature, for example, on the top of Mount Whitney than it does at sea level. And it boils at a lower temperature because of the lower pressure. So water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit here. At the top of Mount Whitney, it boils at about 180 degrees Fahrenheit, which is one of the reasons why you have to let your freeze-dried foods rehydrate for a longer period of time when you're in the mountains and backpacking compared to when you're down at sea level. Well, at some point in time, since the boiling temperature of water continues to drop as you go higher and higher and the pressure drops, at some point in time, water boils at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Why might that be a problem?
Your blood.
Because our bodies are at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so our blood starts to boil at body temperature.
Ouch.
That's bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's called the Armstrong limit.
Oh, gosh.
And so they were above the altitude at which the Armstrong limit exists. And so they had to pressurize their cockpit to be able to prevent that from happening. So to answer your question, the other thing that happens is the partial pressure of oxygen drops. And so they actually didn't have enough oxygen to be able to stay conscious either, just like being on the top of Mount Everest without oxygen. And so we built their rebreather to be an oxygen rebreather. So it circulated 100% oxygen to be able to give them enough partial pressure of oxygen to be able to maintain consciousness.
Wow. Unreal. So do you have anything planned for this winter right now before the end of the year? Or is everything scheduled for next year?
Well, for this year, I'm actually going out to Catalina on Saturday, and they have an emergency treatment facility there called the hyperbaric chamber, which is how we treat scuba diving accidents. And that's manned by a volunteer staff 365 days a year. And so I'm going out there to relieve the facility director so that he can go home for Christmas. And I'll spend Christmas week out there acting as director in charge of this emergency facility in case any scuba divers have an accident and need to be treated.
That's not a bad way to spend Christmas on the island.
No, when I'm not in Antarctica, I do that. I've done that every year for him for about the last 20 years.
That's something else.
Another way of providing service to our communities. Another lesson I learned in scouting, in fact, particularly in the Order of the Arrow.
Have you ever had to go into a hyperbaric chamber?
I've done it. I've done it once for myself in real life. I was doing a body recovery for law enforcement group in Mexico. Where was I? Guadalajara, I think it was. And they had lost 7 police officers in a freak diving accident. And so they were deep enough that their dive team couldn't do the recoveries. And so they had me helping them with that. And the last day of diving operations, I didn't want to dive because I was flying the next day. And they basically pleaded with me to go diving. And I said I would only do it if they would throw me in the chamber prophylactically before I got on the plane. So I finished the last dive. They took me to the chamber. I spent 6 hours in the chamber, and then they took me from the chamber directly to the aircraft, bypassed all of the security protocols, and just walked me right up the door so that I could stay in the chamber as long as I possibly could before I had to fly home, so that I wouldn't get decompression sickness. And then I've been in chambers lots of times to help treat people that have had diving accidents or for training purposes.
Yeah, my wife actually had to spend about 2 hours a day for a week, actually for 30 days for part of her cancer treatment at the hyperbaric chamber down here at Arcadia Methodist.
Yeah, the chambers get used for more than just dive accidents. They get used for smoke inhalation, cancer treatments, diabetic foot treatments, crush injuries, for a whole series of different types of things now.
Yeah, amazing. Jeff, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to our scouts on a Tuesday night. And I've actually been looking forward to this since I saw your post. And I'm like, oh my God, I have to talk to you. I mean, you've given our scouts quite a unique look into the other world of scouting, where scouting can take you. I know that there is an award for scouts that actually go and spend time in Antarctica. If I'm correct, if there's a knot that they get to wear and a medal.
Well, if you work down there through the
Mhm.
National Science Foundation, you actually get awarded a medal through the U.S. Navy. They
Oh,
have
wow.
an Antarctic Service Award that's both a medal and, what bar like the military gets that you can wear if you've worked down there. I don't know if scouting has an award like that or not.
They actually have a medal and a knot.
Really?
If you actually do a travel, that's why it's like I saw this many years ago, and I'm like, oh, how am I going to get down there? This is too cool.
How do I get one of those? I don't have that knot.
You know
on my
what?
thing.
I'll forward it to you. I'll forward you the link.
All right.
But that is totally cool. And I thank you so much for this. And may I ask again if you could come back at some point and maybe talk about cold weather survival and your abilities to survive out in the freezing Antarctica?
Sure, we can do a talk sometime in the future. That'd be
I
fine.
would love that. Thank you so much, sir. I will since I recorded this, I'll put it on in a Google Drive for you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. And Arlene says, thank you for your time and for sharing your experience. Truly remarkable. Wishing you the best with your future adventures.
Thank you, Arlene.
Mr.
And
Bozanic,
hopefully
thank
we'll
you.
see some of you down there sometime.
That is, I got to save up, but yes. Oh, and one of our scout leaders from Troop 185 says, best Zoom ever.
Thank you much.
I actually have to concur. This has been a fun one. Daphne goes, agreed. Jeff, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
All right, you guys too. Bye-bye.
All right, take care, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll be posting the video on our band, guys. Okay. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.